Warm welcome, everybody, and welcome back to the Sustainability Transformation Conference 2020. We're now going with full swing into our third panel, and we're going to talk about a just transition, a question of fairness. This time the panel is completely virtual. Great pleasure to have you all with me on board, and I would like to introduce my panel. Sharon Burrow, you're the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. Warm welcome. Hello, Sharon. Hello, Sharon. Sorry about this. Clemens Goodman. Clemens Goodman, you're the President of the Employers and Business Association Saxony-Anhalt. Good to have you with us here on board, and warm welcome. Then we have Frederick Moch. You're Head of Department at the DGB, the German Trade Union Confederation. Warm welcome to you. Then we have Jan Göldner. Jan Göldner, you're the member of the Executive Committee at the Naturschutzjugend, NAJU. Jan, warm welcome. And last but not least, Luisa Neubauer, you're a climate activist and the co-organizer of Fridays for Future Germany. Great panel. I'm very much looking forward to discussing with you these topics, and I would like to hand over and start with Sharon. This is your question. What is for you the most important aspect when it comes to justice in this context?
Well, if we're talking about justice from a working person's perspective, the unions that represent workers, we have to deal with the convergence of crisis. Before COVID-19, we already had historic levels of inequality due to a distorted distribution of income. People were feeling despair and anger about mere survival in many parts of the world. And that was, of course, also an inequality of race and gender through exclusion. Then you had the climate emergency, and of course that was a matter of human beings risking extinction if we didn't deal with stabilizing the planet. These are huge areas for us to contend with. There were already fractures with a broken labour market where 60% of workers are in the informal economy. That's not good for business or for workers. No rule of law, no minimum wage, no social protection. And indeed, that model actually underpins the new and emerging business models with platform business or internet mediated business, even in our developed economies. You add COVID-19 on top of that, first and foremost, a health crisis, and we just saw how unprepared we were with protective equipment or health and safety regulations, the capacity to actually provide for workers around the world in terms of universal social protection. And while Germany was in a fantastic position with their social dialogue tradition and the DGB and the other unions to actually negotiate advances on the social contract where there were deficiencies, to return to your short-term or part-time working model, then those things worked. But now we have a huge problem. We have 500 million workers out of jobs. We have a despair with 1.6 billion workers in the informal economy facing destitution. So if you put all this together, what will create justice? A just future can only be created if we look at how we have a new social contract that actually sees recovery and resilience. And the key factors, there are many, but the key issues there are jobs, jobs and jobs, climate-friendly jobs. They must be climate-friendly, or we're not doing ourselves any favour about stabilising the planet or creating jobs in new areas with just transition. We have to see rights and universal social protection. The EU got off to a good start with this. Their foundations of the social pillar of rights, the Green Deal and just transition are excellent, and they're a model for the world. But now we need to see it implemented, and we need to see it on focused on the guarantee of jobs and decent incomes. If I can just take one more minute and say to you, there are sustainable jobs. If we invest in the transition, because every sector has to transition, that's just a reality for us. And if you invest in infrastructure, enabling green infrastructure, in protecting and increasing jobs in key sectors like infrastructure, care, manufacturing, heavy industry, transport, agriculture, all of these sectors and more, we can protect and create jobs, but it must be investment in jobs that are indeed real jobs, decent work, and that they're climate friendly. And I would just say cities are critical to this. If you look at the mass of the population and the demand and supply chain, from each of the cities in terms of demanding products and the supply of products, you also help then with planning the rural economies or the hinterland, whether it's in Germany or whether it's through global trade. So we need some massive reform of our global infrastructure in terms of multilateralism. But if rights and environmental standards are not part of fair competition, if we don't actually address inequality through jobs, decent work, social protection, and that social pillar of rights, we will fail again. And people will simply not trust in governments. Indeed, in our democracies, you can see the trust going like that. And I would just say Germany is well served. You actually have works councils, co-determination, tripartite agreements, all based on a culture of social dialogue. This is a model we want widely shared.
So a strong focus on decent jobs, decent work, sustainable jobs to tackle inequality. Maybe same question over to you, Clemens Goodman. What is your perspective on this? What is for you the key aspect in order to make a just transition happen?
Thank you very much. Yeah, actually, there is hardly anything, Ms. Burrow, I can disagree with. I just want to add one more figure, one more entity that's also necessary, at least from a German perspective. You may need quite some entrepreneurs that help to create these jobs. Some of the jobs are generated in organizations, like in the health sector, which in many European countries is public. But many others jobs, you need to find volunteers, so to speak. And Germany and many other, not all, but many other European countries have a structure where like more than half of the jobs, sometimes in some economies even 75, 80%, are in small and medium-sized enterprises. So I just want to appeal to all these volunteers that we need. You need to found or increase or make grow the company so that these jobs can be generated. And let's hope it's not per se a steel mill that you're founding, but it's rather in a sector that is less loaded with carbon weight. We may come to steel mills later on because we may still need some steel mills for some time. But I just want to add one single point. I'm more a technician, and I always tend to bring things down when we talk about justice, or I hesitate a little bit to use the word justice. I like to talk more about fairness, because as an entrepreneur, I lead. We started with 0 employees 25 years ago. Now we are 5,000. I will never be able to create justice in my company. I don't even strive at it. I strive to be fair and have a fair, balanced system. And this is something I can probably reach in this life. I will never in this life reach justice. But if we talk about fairness or exchange or balancing, if we bring it down, at least if in a German perspective, it may be the access of all people, all citizens, or most of all citizens, to those means and tools that are part of a more sustainable life. So bring it down to housing, for example. A poor household will hardly, either in a rental context or in an owned house, will find it hard to invest into equipment isolation, photovoltaics, etc., that makes living more sustainable. If you're wealthy, that's easier. Sustainable investments in housing usually pay off, but they pay off at a very long term. So if you're wealthy, you're fine. If you're poor, you're not. And in this case, in Germany, there are some programs. They are medium well, but they are there at least. Public loans to soften, to solve this situation, to, for example, dedicated at children-rich families, families with poor, little income, to get a very long-term, very low-interest credit that so the savings you can reach with sustainable investments into housing, isolation, photovoltaics, etc. You can do it comparatively independent from your income. You have a chance to access. The access is not perfect, but there is at least the attempt. And I think this is a small example for a tool that can create some fairness in access to these techniques and these tools and these means that are basis for sustainable life.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm happy that we have both in the title, just and fairness. So I think we find a good compromise here.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it's good to link back to what Sharon Burrow said at the beginning. It means kind of that the high levels of inequality that we see now are also kind of a limitation for households, for individuals to make that transformation process. That's what I hear from you. I would like to hand over to Frederik Moch and hear your perspective. Are there any aspects where you say, oh, this is where I disagree, this is what I would like to add to the discussion? Over to you.
Well, yeah, thank you for the invitation and for this great panel. So from my point of view, lots of good aspects were mentioned so far. So if it comes to the transition, I think we have to think it from the people. So if we do not have the acceptance of the people, we will lose them, and the world is lost too, and it would be a very big problem. So let us talk about how we can shape this transition in such a way that it is just and fair, and that we also create it in a way that the innovations we can use are used in a way that we also have some kind of social innovations and not only technological innovations, because it's all about the people. And I think this is one of the main points. And as Sharon, for example, mentioned, it's a big problem in this COVID crisis, for example, that the inequality is rising so far. And this is also a specific problem when it comes to the transformation, because it's very different in the specific regions all over the planet. So we have to think on these aspects and these impacts of the transition and try to create it in a way that we do not lose the acceptance, that we strengthen the acceptance and strengthen the participation of the people in this whole process.
So involving people really means activating people. Luisa Neubauer, over to you. I mean, this is where you certainly are strong, have a lot of good experience now. First of all, what would you like to add? What are important aspects for just transition? And actually then, how do you activate people to make that transformation process happen?
Well, first of all, hello, and thank you so much for having me and inviting me to this round. I would very much like to stress and underline what Sharon has pointed out. I think there's really it really turns out that there is no justice or fairness in jobs and social dimensions without climate justice, without accepting the fact that jobs need to work towards a sustainable and just future for everyone. And so dignified work also means, being able to work in a context where you are sure, where you know that you work towards the future and not against it. And I think here the aspect of guaranteed jobs is really interesting, especially in the German context. We talk a lot about jobs, yet we talk about jobs as a very short-term investment. So we enlarge jobs, especially when we talk of the coal sector here, which is a very vibrant topic, to be something that we need to protect, whereas we actually know we are kind of protecting a transition that is happening anyway and not guaranteeing those jobs. So what does it mean, building guaranteed jobs? It means investing in something that is sustainable, that's long-lasting. And I think here really the job dimension and the climate dimension come together very nicely. When we talk about mobilizing people, activating people, I think there is we aren't usually telling the full story. Because the story we are telling is that there is climate action, climate mitigation, transition that needs to happen, and that we need to find acceptance for. Yet the untold part of that is what is happening if we don't do all that. That is the story of the climate crisis that is currently, right in this very moment, taking away people's existence and people's livelihood. And of course, any kind of job perspective there could possibly be. And this isn't just a thing that is happening, say, in the global south, but this is happening everywhere. Looking at Australia last summer, looking at California right now, looking at Central America, looking really across the globe, the whole picture is the planet being in a climate crisis and us working towards a sustainable future and a prevention of that crisis, which is why we're having to do all these transitions in the first place. So I think that is one really significant and fundamental aspect when it comes to mobilizing people and wanting people to accept transitions that are being made. It is not for nothing, and it's not just because we feel like we should be more climate friendly, but because we are in a crisis that is there, that is threatening people, that is threatening people's financial and economic existence. And our reaction to that is a just and sustainable transition towards a more sustainable future. And I think that is the bigger picture that we need to talk about. And then at the end of the day, we're getting to a point when we can actually talk about opportunities here, because we are seeing, and that was pointed out earlier as well too, that even without a climate crisis, even without a corona crisis, we are experiencing inequalities that we cannot tolerate anymore and that are threatening societies, that are threatening peace, that is threatening the way that we can live with each other in kindness and empathy. Yet, so, even without any kind of ecological matter, there are so many reasons to work towards a more equal, just and fair way of dealing with jobs and people's economic existence. And I think that is also one aspect that we really need to highlight here. What comes after this transitions? What is the opportunities we can get out of that? And I think getting those 2 points together, adding the dimension of the climate as a threat for people, not for the climate, but for the people, for their health, for their safety, for their jobs on the one side, and adding this with the aspect of opportunities of the opportunities of real justice and real equality, that actually gets together as, I think, a very much mobilizing and activating point in history where we can really get together and make those shifts that are needed.
Thank you very much for this. I'll definitely keep that point with the inequality part that we are going to dive in a little bit deeper in a second. First, going to hear from Jan, your point of view. What makes a just transition for you? What are the most important aspects?
Yeah, I agree with Lisa. So I think whenever we have a group of people which is the most affected by any decisions this group has not made, we should raise the question whether this is justified or not. And I think we can strongly see this in 2 points. Luisa already mentioned this. So first, in an intergenerational context, because it will be the future of any single person from my generation, although not every person is allowed to vote. So it is a fact that people who will be most affected by current actions are not involved in the decision-making processes. And I think we have to change this. And the second part is in a global context, because of our lifestyles and a huge economic growth, we have emitted much more greenhouse gas emissions throughout the past years than countries in the global south. And in fact, we are carrying a huge responsibility here. And for me, these are the two most important points in the question of justice or fairness.
Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you very much to all of you. That was a great discussion, and thank you very much.